There was this current narrative within a lot of the LegacyCos that, even they write about it in all their press releases. We have trained 100,000 people on AI this year, whatever that may mean. Fundamentally, you're trying to augment them into workflows which need rethinking. But at the core of it, the business model is the one which is causing the most friction. They're trying to force fit into the system that they can do this. Whereas the system is saying, like, if the plane is changing, then we may have to rethink this from a first principles basis.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Meg and Amy Show. Today, we are interviewing Usman Sheikh, an entrepreneur and investor who spent the last 2 decades building, scaling, and exiting companies across technology and professional services verticals. He's the founder of High Output Ventures, where he invests in and builds organizations designed to thrive in the new era of work. When he posted an article titled, "Your people aren't your problem, your model is," it hit a nerve for Meg and me. Today, we're going to explore his thinking, grounded in his deep exploration of professional services organizations, on how and if today's legacy orgs actually can transform in the new AI economy. Welcome, Usman.
Great to be here. Excited to be here. Just swapping comments with both of you on LinkedIn, and here we are now.
It's amazing how that can happen.
You just get stalked by crazy people, and next thing you know, you're on a podcast. What can you do?
I think it was the quality of the conversation and the links that you sent over were sort of like really, because I think like we read some parallel stuff, but there was lots of things that you sent over that were really aligned with how I was thinking about things. And
well, it's really impressive because we refer to Meg as an acquired taste, and like you acquired her taste really quickly. It was very impressissive. So it just shows like how quickly you can process difficult subjects and come out winning.
The fun ones, the best ones, the difficult ones.
All right. Well, so before we dive into our meaty topics today, I understand that you have become a father for the very first time. So is that why you are writing so many articles? Is it something to do with midnight bottle feeding? Tell us more.
It could be. At 4 a.m. you do get some ideas. Like that comment really triggered something, and I should like write something down. But I think it's been great. I think like with fatherhood, what's happened is that compression of time has become very important. So there are concepts and things that I want to communicate to the portfolio that I think like by writing them also gets the message across, and then they can have questions about it. So it's a way as for me to both learn, for me to disseminate information, and connect with interesting people. So I think it hits all the notes over there.
And how's fatherhood?
Fatherhood has been fun. I think like I was scared actually as I got married much later in life. Like, how is this going to be? Like, it seems to be a very large life adjustment. But I'm very fortunate to have a very supportive sort of like wife and family around me, which has made the transition a lot easier. It was actually one of the reasons why we also moved from Singapore to Dubai over the last 18 months. So just, I think having a support system around you is massively helpful, which we do in Dubai. And between those diaper changes and bottle feeds, it really makes you value your time a lot more.
I like to say that becoming a parent is one of those places where you get thrown into a role you have zero expertise or skill for, no matter what your background is with babies. It's very, very different when you're responsible for them all in. And I think that the skill that you develop, that sort of resilience and figuring it out, and how good babies are at teaching you. So you get very good at paying more attention to cues that are nonverbal. I think all of that is actually makes you a better human for sure. So congratulations, there's no bigger job for sure.
And so, speaking of writing extensively, you've been writing a lot about how traditional business models are fundamentally broken. So walk us through when you first realized this shift wasn't just another business cycle, just another regular business cycle, and that the math completely changed.
I think to provide context, around 12 to 18 months ago, I got involved with a private equity fund which was doing accounting firm roll-ups. So I don't necessarily directly come from a professional service background, and this was my first foray in figuring out like how these traditional businesses, which were built for a world of human leverage, were operating, and how they were struggling with the shift to technology leverage. And when I think about these firms, they were like bolting on software, they were trying to augment workflows, but at the core, the operating system of the firm was not being challenged or touched. And at that point, like, you know, in the writing, it sort of like diverged into LegacyCo and NewCo, where LegacyCo, in my head, is the traditional professional service organization, which has maybe partners, billable hours, a hierarchical structure, which looks a certain way. And NewCo is this different type of professional service firm, which is built on flywheels, ontologies, workflows, micro-enterprises, agents, and the like. And it has been a framework which has helped me layer in as to what that could look like. And that's what I'm writing about, because I think the playbook for service as software is like in the first inning, and that's what I'm basically calling NewCo, which are these tech-enabled software companies.
I love that for a couple things. First off, I love the fact that you came into it as an outsider, and so you were able to look at the problem with a different set of eyes. And then you realized that the bias towards taking that problem and trying to fix it with the same tools and the same structures becomes much more obvious because you're looking at the problem as opposed to starting with the existing operating system of the firm. One of the things that you mentioned is that this thought of going from A to B being a reskilling problem is looking at it all wrong. And this is something that Amy and I have been pondering for a while, and we've been pondering it across multiple types of businesses. But I love the fact that you're going deep on a single industry with professional services, because I think that gets to a lot of where tech is evolving as well. So help me understand your thesis around why reskilling is the wrong problem, because there's a lot of people focused on helping people develop and build skills.
When I wrote that piece, there was this current narrative within a lot of the legacy cos that, you know, even they write about it in all their press releases. We have trained 100,000 people on AI this year, whatever that may mean. It usually means 4 hours of an online training program, which completes. But if we're even being nice, I don't know how you skill up so many people. But I think, like, fundamentally, you're trying to augment them into workflows which need rethinking. But at the core of it, the business model is the one which is causing the most friction, because all professional services firms at a very abstract level are headcount multiplied by a hourly rate multiplied by utilization. And what we're talking about with reskilling is like, we'll reskill this, we'll keep this constant, and all of the utilization will go up. But now we're seeing instances whereby utilization can go massively above 100%, and then suddenly the number of people required to deliver the service goes down. And I think, like, they're trying to force fit into the system that they can do this, whereas the system is saying, like, if the plane is changing, then we may have to rethink this from a first principles basis. And that's why I come in with, whether flywheels help me to decipher like how does value get created in an organizations, and then ontologies help me to map how that work gets delivered. And this is all done in these enterprises, but it's in people's heads, and it is charged by the hour or fixed price or whatever they do it. And I think like that's why we're trying to solve a problem with the wrong solution, and it's giving a lot of people hope. Because on the flip side, this is the narrative, and when I talk with leadership behind closed doors, we're talking about what would it look like if we had 30,000 less people at the org. And there seems to be a very large disconnect between the two, because the market is now sniffing this out as well, where all the large SI companies are not reporting any headcount growth. And while revenue is slowly creeping up, the market is now punishing them and saying like, hey, I think like there's a bit of disruption going on over here.
Yeah. I started my career in professional services software automation. And I always believe that professional services is the tip of the spear when it comes to where you start to see human impact first, right? Because it is a human, is such a human profession, as it turns out. And I think, what's really interesting is that professional services organizations have been looking at it like, oh, it's just any other thing that we need to teach our consultants to talk about well and to discuss with their clients, right? Like, oh, it's a new topic, AI. So we need to train everybody up to be able to talk about AI and to, deliver AI. But without thinking about like, well, what does this actually mean? Like, so I think it's a great insight that you came across. It's amazing.
I think it's also interesting the kind of concept of professional services organizations. Their business is to help business, right? And why this is so interesting is because they need to help themselves in forming their own business model. And of course, this is a classic case where why you've been successful in the past becomes a hindrance to your opportunity in the future, because you get very biased and dependent on things that you have designed in the past that have worked so well. So it's very hard to see the signal that, hey, what your entire business model is the problem. So like, help me understand where you see the new business model going. What's making the difference for businesses that are looking at this problem, that they recognize that the force multiplier of just add more people and stir is not the solution? How are they getting out of that trap, or how should they get out of that trap?
On one side, you have LegacyCo attempting what one commenter called RefreshCo, like how do we refresh like the whole organization? The challenge that I think with RefreshCo is like if the numbers become 50,000, 100,000, 500,000, is that possible? And in many of the cases, I think like the spin-outs are the way out, but most of the time, whether you look at like Ford trying to do EVs inside the business, it becomes very difficult to have two competing sort of like businesses run together with leadership. I mean, Korn Ferry is talking about this in their earnings as well. And so I think like refreshing at that scale is very difficult. I believe like I wrote an article which said like big consulting's choice, at least from my perspective, is to do a full NewCo spin out with other external investors included in it. So that is just not the entity. The main entity can hold 50%, but there has to be greater accountability from other counterparts. And it needs to be cannibalizing parts of LegacyCo's businesses from the outside. It's very difficult because incentive structures come into place now. Like, what's the incentive over here? Someone wants to defend this, and the people want to grow this. And if you talk to any of the large corporates which have done spin-outs, they haven't been too successful because there are too many guardrails as to what they can and cannot do. So that's on one side. It's a very difficult problem to solve. I think it's classic innovator's dilemma. And whereas firms like IBM or anyone else has been able to reinvent, perhaps through cycles, even missing cycles. It's possible, but I think it's a function of leadership more than anything else. I think where I'm seeing then on the other side, which is NewCos without legacy infrastructure, is where it's getting very interesting, because I'm seeing very small teams, whether they're using some technology stack like Palantir or ServiceNow or Databricks, and they're playing this playbook of trying to map all the workflows, map all the data, trying to figure out how do we embed intelligence into these companies. And that's where I think I've seen and had the most interesting conversations. I spoke to a gentleman who's running a decently sized consulting firm, which saved a government $20 million on AWS deployments that they were doing. And he had billed at 17.5% of savings and things like that. So he got the outcome, he got his money linked to it. He had a much smaller sort of like structure to absorb the risk. Because I think in the book that we were referencing, Sangeet's book, Reshuffle, he talks about if the constraint no longer is knowledge and cognition, then it goes to risk. And then how do we sort of manage risk in professional services is an interesting tangent, which I didn't fully appreciate until I went very deep into it as to how much risk and indemnity coverage these firms carry. So if they do make a mistake, they have the backings to sort of not go bankrupt. Whereas NewCo is probably going to struggle with that, so they'll have to be smaller, which is why I think full frontal attacks are not the way forward. I think smart wedges into growing segments is where I'm at least seeing the greatest inbound for people who are leaving these firms.
So Usman, obviously the NewCos have the advantage in terms of not having that legacy baggage, and then LegacyCos have the option to do a spin out, as you mentioned, a refresh co, et cetera. But what about actually transforming within the LegacyCo? Do you think that is possible?
I mean, given that I haven't worked at a very large firm, and both of you have, I'd probably push that question back to both of you. Working at a larger firm, do you think that it's possible? I'll give you my soundbite first. I personally think until you don't create broader guardrails, until you don't delegate judgment down, until you don't give greater autonomy, I personally think it's going to be very difficult. Because if it's concentrated on the top and a certain group of people make all the decisions what refresh code needs to look like, I think coherence is going to be a massive problem.
I think you're right. I mean, the first thing is that organizations need to acknowledge they have a problem. And that is happening at the top. But when you start to talk to folks lower in the organization, they're not getting it yet. And they're the ones that need to execute it. But they need to, understand what it is that they need to transform, right? So I think that knowledge is starting to get out there, thanks to you and others. The orchestration to execute it, and then to really integrate that back to their existing systems. But most organizations are trying to do these transformations with tools that weren't designed for people and AI working together, and also weren't designed to be adaptive and dynamic, right? So when I've been talking with leaders lately, what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of experimentation and pilots happening with AI, but with really no sense of what the ROI could be, or really being able to deliver on that ROI. But one of the things that I heard recently that was really interesting was, if you are going to really tackle truly changing the operating model, you need to find pockets of the organization that are going to be able to withstand that change, will be excited about it, because those first opportunities are really going to pave the way for the future. So finding pockets, in a particular organization structure where people are heavily leveraging AI, are starting to use agents, are starting to use them in repeatable ways, not just personal productivity improvements, but actually, hey, we've got our whole team running better because we deployed this agent, and everyone's kind of excited about it. So being able to take that particular sub-organization and actually, layer on additional transformations, and then being able to use that as a way to show the rest of the organization what's possible. So that's where I'm seeing a little bit of hope.
Hope is a form of planning. It's a very important part.
Right.
I think so. Having lived multiple transformations, although I do believe this one is bigger than the past. So having done a lot of moving technology within an organization, moving business models to the cloud from on-premise, things like that. I think you both are onto some really important pieces of transformation. Obviously, finding the people that are motivated and have a probability of liking to live in a little bit more ambiguity and willing to try things and figure it out. I think the other piece, though, and this is where I see you grasping, and I think the NewCos are going to lead the way, is we need to prove the model. We need to figure out what business model actually works. And this is where starting from scratch gives you a real advantage, because the Salesforce was created as a new model to show the way of how SaaS businesses might be. And in that moment, it starts initially as maybe this could work, and then it's crazy with a lot of pushback, and then everybody starts to catch on. You could say the same with AWS. You could say the same with a lot of different places where we've had these disruptors. So back to your innovator's dilemma. So I think proving the model, and then I do think within a large organization, I like your idea of a spinoff. I also like the process of having a wedge, right? Finding, again, something that helps prove that model and build that confidence so that you can understand how much you should spin off at what rate, and also what types of incentive shifts should you make in that spinoff. I think all of those things are really, really critical into this idea of transformation.
Listening to those two things, I think you mentioned Salesforce as well. Like, I was talking to someone from Salesforce earlier today, and they were talking, they were at the firm for a long time, and they were like, Benioff sort of like spun out of Oracle, created Salesforce. Ellison was late to the party with understanding the wave. But today he was like, Benioff sits at the same spot that Ellison was
That's
at.
right.
He is more aware about the shifts, but I think coming back to Amy's point now, how do you sort of like build those pockets of excellence within it? Because I think what I'm also hearing from the ground up is like, even in professional services organizations, let's say one pyramid leader has figured out how to do his or her job a lot better. Compensation banding is very rigid and doesn't sort of like reward that person for running 50% leaner than they are right now. Token bonuses don't matter, okay? Like, the value needs to be there. So the compensation and then the diffusion of the pocket across the org requires coherence from the top as well. So when Satya came down and wrote in 2014 his memo to the company and said, by the way, guys, these are like the 4 things that we're going to focus on. And then, he provided that overarching, here's where we're going. And then I think like the business was able to take up on that. And that's when both the top and the bottom meet together, which is, I think, the scale problem. Microsoft and some of these organizations are great sort of like examples of refresh goals that have done exemplary sort of like well in certain parts of their business. So it is possible. It requires leadership, requires a whole bunch of pieces to put into place. And the most important one requires sometimes the market giving you the breathing space to allow for this to happen. And the WNS example is a great example of a business which was an Indian BPO. When I looked at their business, I really liked the business. 24% of revenue coming from outcome-based contracts and all of the things. I was like, this business is doing 1.3 billion. But the fact of the matter is that their investment into R&D was a fraction of what it needed to be for them to play this new game. And therefore, the market was not allowing them to say, like, listen, we're going to go margins or flat margins for the next 12 quarters in order to ride this wave, and it's going to be worth it. The market was like, no, you're a SI company. We value you. You like this. And if you do not behave in these bands, you get punished. And by the way, when you get punished, the private equity guys basically show up and say, like, hey, your business is looking fairly attractive right now, and we would like to buy you. And mid-caps
or the activist investors jump in and say, yeah. So I do have one thing with the narrative of the Larry story, because I've said for a long time, the market narrative is exactly what you said. Larry was late to see it. I would argue Larry was in this WNS situation where the business of Oracle was producing so much cash, very similar, the database was bringing in such a good and reliable business to the market that the idea of saying, I'm going to disrupt that business to jump off to a new model did not make rational economic sense in the context of being a public company. And I think you've just hit a very, very important thing. Like, markets are very excited right now about revenue per employee, bringing down costs, but not about changing what it really costs to change over a business model. So you need both clarity of where you're going in a business model, and you also need the context to be successful in that business model. And that's where I think the rationality of things like spinoffs or NewCos just have so much more advantage, because they don't have the weight of expectations based on a prior business model.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the exemplar refresh co. So, you talk about fewer people, higher leverage, delivered outcomes, but what does the new operating system look like? And you've written a little bit about RDHY and some examples there. Do you want to share a little bit about, is that the exemplar, and how does that work?
So the way that I look at NewCos, at least from my high level thesis, is 3 layers. So it starts with, Jim Collins-esque flywheels, understand where value is created, because I think like that is at the core of every business. If you don't get that right, I don't think anything works, but let's assume that you get that right. And then I think most of the time, traditionally, myself included, you would break down the org structure in a traditional sales, marketing, support, product, finance, and all the rest. And I think this is where the deviation in my head happens now, because how does the value get delivered from the flywheel is the next question I ask. For example, so I'm running most of these experiments on my portfolio today, and saying okay, we have to figure out whether what I'm saying is right or crazy, or let's learn. So e-commerce company is growing very quickly. Now, the traditional Amazon flywheel was greater selection, more customers, more traffic, which led to more suppliers, which led to more selection, and the flywheel spun. Now, a lot of people could take that, but when we started working with this e-commerce companies, creators were at the core of their model. Without the creators, there was no spinning. The creators were creating content, which were running in these purchases, which then led to this other creator school where they were getting more creators in their flywheel. And so we map out the the flywheel, and then we figure out how do we deliver this value to customers that they're buying, and then we start to map out every workflow, every entity, how is this delivered within the org? Not in traditional marketing structures, but who's responsible for creators? How do you onboard them? What is the onboarding process? What data do you take from the creators? How do you know a creator is doing a good job or not a bad job? All of this was available in a spreadsheet somewhere, but I don't think you can go NewCo without sort of having that data readily available. So then we do this ontology mapping process, which is a fancy way of just mapping the business and workflows out, which I started going much deeper on because I think that enables that data layer. And once we map that out, then there are certain entities and resources that are in the map. And I think now you can draw, what I learned from Hire was if we have to delegate judgment to the edges, how do we sort of give responsibility and ownership of some of these entities to people who are closer to the customer and the P&L? And that's when you start to wrap the entities from the map with certain people and say, listen, the three of us are responsible for this entity. This is your P&L. This is how you create impact. And by the way, if you don't do a good job, we can point and say okay, maybe we need a new sort of leader. That is from a high level how I chunk down all the way to how a micro enterprise works. And this is what we're doing at our entity right now. So the people who are responsible for the creators are not only responsible for the creators, but which one of the creators is resulting in more sales for the creator, what content are they creating. And I think the hardest part that I'm trying to figure out right now is that how do we make the coordination between all of these layers a lot more cleaner? Because I think coordination is the big block right now, which is always a block. But I think in larger organizations, the coordination is sales and marketing can coordinate. In my Wipro piece, I think I wrote they have a delivery problem. So a bunch of sales leaders from the org messaged me and said, it's all the delivery people's fault. We're closing the sales. They're not. The delivery people messaged me and said, the sales guys are selling all this other stuff. We can't deliver. And so you're right on point. And so I'm stuck in the middle and saying, this is a coordination cost. How do we avoid this from happening? Because I think each one of them may be hitting certain metrics.
So, we worked at SAP and we would always get into trouble because the customer would get so frustrated because an entire bus of people would show up for, a meeting or a demo or something because there were so many redundant roles and coordination and no one trusted anyone. No one had the broad expert, you know what I mean? It hits home. So keep going.
And I think that is a coordination cost. I think a lot of LegacyCos will look at this and say, hey, Usman, very easy for you to say managing 50, 100, 500 people. Multiply this to 5,000 or 50,000, now you have the real coordination cost. But I think that's where we have to then rethink, do we actually need to run a business with 5,000 or 50,000 people? So the inbuilt assumption is for you to scale the business, you will need more people. And I think that's what the technology is challenging now. Do you really need all that many people to do so? And I think if you delegate judgment to the edges, you'll get more ownership, which will result in higher output per employee and greater connectedness. And at least that's my hope. I don't think LegacyCos, NewCos are going to be these massive businesses today, but even if they can build out 50, 100, $200 million businesses, I don't think this is a short sort of battles right now. The larger transformation will come maybe in 5, 10 years as technology develops. But that's why I never think of it in my head now as LegacyCo versus NewCo. I'm you guys play your game, we're going to play our game, and we're going to structure ourselves like this, go for this. And I have a feeling a lot of LegacyCos are going to be very interested in NewCos to acquire them if they hit any degree of scale, because they'll be this is very valuable. But so will the hyperscalers.
So meaning the LegacyCos will get acquired by the NewCos and not the reverse.
Well, or the LegacyCos could look at a NewCo ramping very quickly. Let's say that we figure out a way how to solve a messy global procurement problem, and we've done this vertical really well. Well, a LegacyCo could come and buy us, but I think the more interesting person who's going to be looking at us is the OpenAIs and the Palantirs of the world, because guess what? They trade at very different multiples to the other guys, and they probably come and buy because every dollar of revenue that they get from a NewCo is amplified in valuation. So for them, I just don't think it's a fair game for anyone who doesn't have their scale right now. I mean, when I saw Google's infra budget for the year was $75 billion, and Deloitte's global revenue last year, I think, was $67 billion. Global revenue, 470,000 people. Is this the same fight? I really don't think so. One person is spending $75 billion on infra, and the other one is taking 500,000 people to generate 67. Yeah, it doesn't seem fair to me.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the coordination problem, but I know Amy has a lot to say on this. But I think that one of the things that we miss is that in successful legacy companies, the operating models and the organization structures and the business models were all built to really address this coordination problem at scale, right? Because they recognized that there were, and they grew into it, of course, but this happened well before probably the leaders that are in charge of it today were part of that process. And so what starts to break down, and this gets back to Sanjit's book, it starts to break down when pieces have to change and you start moving these things around, you recognize that new bottlenecks and new coordination problems emerge. And so I think that what's interesting about this moment is not just the technology automation, but also the digital footprint that we have to understand where these problems are emerging and to think about how do we adapt. Again, the challenge is we haven't built the capacity in our processes and in our leadership to ask these questions, because the first principles of the business were developed long before the people that are running these businesses were part of them, right? I mean, in some cases before they were born. Yeah. So transformation becomes complicated because of that skill. So Amy, I know you've been talking to a lot of businesses about how this transformation, like what kind of information you need to drive a transformation. What are you seeing in that?
Yeah, so the we were talking about the skilling problem, right? And how that isn't actually the main problem. And so most organizations have been really focused on skills and reskilling and future skills over the last few years, but reskilling isn't going to solve the problem. The problem is the work. What are the work outcomes that we need to see, and how do we align around it? So in order to get to that, you need to understand all of the tasks that make up that work and what tasks can be done better by AI potentially, and what tasks can be done better by humans. But it's not just that simple, right? Because then you need to model it all. You need to see, okay, well, what is the impact of the overall workflow and operating model? What are the impacts on the human people? not just the humans, but the human people. It's a big distinction. And how they are able to operate, and then you start to get to the skills, right? So there is a reskilling opportunity here, but it's layered underneath all of the understanding of what is it that we're trying to achieve? What are the mechanisms to achieve that? Modeling it out to figure out what our appetite and our ability as an organization is to transform to that. And then once you kind of have all that sorted out, then you need to start reskilling. You need to help the managers to be able to not only supervise people, but to supervise AI agents, for example, to be able to motivate their teams and to ensure everyone understands how to make AI agents accountable, not just there, but actually creating good quality deliverables and making sure that they fit into the overall workflow. You need to understand kind of those network relationships amongst not just people, but also the AI. And so it requires a whole different operating system underneath than we have today. Right now, we've got org charts. We've got workflows that sit inside a company, and are rather static. We have job architectures that require, completely bundled jobs. And what we really need is orchestration maps, and we need cross-entity workflows that are highly adaptive, and we need more of a dynamic work architecture that's looking at tasks and things. So that underlying operating system isn't really fit for purpose for what NewCos and what refresh codes need.
As you were layering the complexity of the problem, I was thinking about what are the incentives in place to start this process. Because we could start this process, like we said, in a pocket of excellence and say, okay, you guys get this budget, let's do this, and we'll review it at the next board meeting or the next quarterly or stuff like that. But I think what we're talking about is fundamentally sort of changing large parts of the business, which will also result in extremely difficult decisions to make. If you assume that a certain division was doing a certain coordinating task, which will now be done by agents orchestrating, do we they may have domain knowledge, do we reskill them to transfer them to somewhere else? Do we let them go? And I think that is the challenge. So when I speak to leaders in the professional service space, especially the larger ones, everyone can see the problems that you're talking about, but no one wants to make the hard decisions because there's no incentive to do so. One person just told me from a game theory perspective, he was like, I have no incentive to do this first. Because if I do this first, it doesn't work out. Technology takes longer to catch up. I get whacked. And then if, it could work out to me, but the probability is low. And then my compensation is not tied to that outcome too directly. And that's why I think it just comes down to compensation incentive structure. So Bezos comes to mind, when he was creating it, there was a period where he said, trust me, we're investing in this architecture, and everyone hammered the stock, but you had to have faith in the leader. I think this is the other switch between founder-driven businesses and bringing someone else in. It makes a huge difference because who cares enough to do these things? You have to really put yourself on the line to make some of these things happen. And I think it comes down to caring enough. One thing is compensating you. I was reading about the Boeing new CEO making all of these changes, and today he was in the FT saying the company is back on track. But the past leadership made all sorts of decisions which led to a lot of other not very nice things to happen, and then someone comes in and he's cleaning up, and then that repeats. And so I think it's a complicated thing. It comes down to leadership. Most things come down to leadership.
So let's talk a little bit about the human impact, right? So obviously, all of these cuts mean fewer people, and that means fewer jobs and a lot of people potentially out of work. You got yourself into a little bit of trouble with one of your essays or comments or what have you in terms of what to do about that. And then you had, I think, a bit of an aha moment about what really we should be thinking about. Do you want to share just a little bit about that experience for you?
Being an entrepreneur, not really having the job, it might be easier for me to say, hey, by the way, you can do this side thing and make some money, and that's. I think it comes relatively easy, even though some people might believe that is the right thing to tell people, self-sufficiency is important. But I think building the capabilities within the people to do this. I was talking to a gentleman today. He's written a book, which I like. I think it's out now. I got an early copy. It's called Agency at Work. He's a senior partner at Deloitte, and he's written about agency, and he's written about 10 things that people can do to raise their agency. And in the conversation we had, he said, you don't need to be super high agency to get a lot of things. He has an index, and he said if anyone even falls in the middle of the agency index, they can still make a lot of things happen. So I think ultimately it happens how do we equip people with this way of thinking that there are different sort of portfolio bets that you can eventually start to make, which don't put your neck on the line, and building this agency muscle. Because I think a lot of people are very upset about a social contract breaking. And I think that's where this is coming. And the news does not help. Like today's article about revenue per employee, it was triggered by a Wall Street Journal article about the same thing, about CEOs I'm not. And then everyone in my comments is Usman, RPE has been a very old metric. I was
right. Yeah. We've been jerks forever. Why is this new?
Yeah. And the measure of a company is based on this. I was listen, there was a Wall Street Journal article with 1,400 comments below it, where the CEOs are basically saying, we're very happy with attrition, and I'm very happy with reducing my headcount every quarter. I said, this does not sound correctly with what we're... And the comments, if you read the comments, and I read the comments, they're two different worlds that we're talking about. And so the human cost is going to be considerable. I think who takes responsibility for this? I think organizations are basically saying, you have to take responsibility for this. I got into another tangential sort of argument where someone was talking about they're not the biggest fan of remote work because they were I like going to the office. I like the micro interactions. I like seeing people. And with remote work, I don't get that. And companies need to sort of reorient. But I'm after the companies have figured out that we don't need all these people in the office, I don't think suddenly, some financial firms will say okay, come back to the office because it's important, but I think majority of firms will not. So basically the corporation is basically saying, if you would like to build a social network about yourself, the company is no longer going to provide it to you, so you please go and try to figure out how to build a social net around yourself for those micro interactions. And I think what I'm just seeing as a macro trend is just the push back to the individual. You have agency. If you would like these things, please make it happen. But our education system is not preparing us for this. Our society is not structured for this. And I think it's going to be a messy middle, as Scott Bessey calls it, that we're stuck in because we're in a transitionary sort of moment where everything seems to be just moving in flux.
So one thing I would add on to your thing, because I think you're exactly right. This period is messy. It creates a lot of vulnerability, and we all deal with our own vulnerability with different mechanisms. But I do believe that your bigger point about what we need for the transformation to really take root is we do need leaders to care. We need leaders to care about how they position their business and how they position their workers to be doing work that is sustainably going to survive, and that it's going to survive in the new envelope of success, which is going to be very different than how we measured success in the past. This is not going to be easy, but I do believe that each of us as leaders, as thinkers, as people that are looking at the future and helping to map it, we can help chart that path for people by creating clarity of what is valued in the future and how do you position yourself in a way that those new opportunities and those new values will be leveraging your human capabilities. And so while the answer isn't clear, the pieces are quite clear in my mind about how each of us can be part of that, and which is why I'm so eager and always enjoying having these conversations about where is the future, because the more that we see it coming, the better job we can do to both mentally prepare but also emotionally prepare for what does leadership look like in this world of all of this change.
Right. And so though though maybe the compensation incentives aren't there just yet, what we're trying to do on this show is really two things. One is from an organization standpoint, understanding that the organizational design is going to need to change in order to take advantage of these opportunities. And then on the individual side, the individual leader or just professional, for them to be able to understand the business context and how the business context is changing and how their own unique value, they need to keep their own unique value, but figure out how that shifts according to the changing business context. So they need to be essentially both a generalist and a specialist at what they deliver and a generalist in terms of how they think. And these are a bit of kind of that recipe for success in order to navigate that future organizational redesign. So that's kind of our hopeful perspective here on the Meg and Amy show.
It's much needed, I can tell you that. A lot of people have a lot of questions which do not have answers. And I don't think I have the answers or all the answers, maybe some inklings of them, but at least it's a start, right?
Yeah, well, and you're doing a brilliant job of diagnosing the problem and pulling in, examples in the world of things going well and where things are not going so well. And that's such a huge contribution to this entire conversation. Okay, so here's where we take a question from a friend of the show. We just did a round of layoffs and we have a hiring freeze. Our CEO expects us to keep delivering the same work, but we're drowning. What do I tell my team? What are my options?
Yeah, so I think first of all, recognizing that it's probably a tough situation. So if layoffs have happened and your team is already drowning, I think the first thing, instead of strategizing how to do more with less, will be probably figuring out how the team is actually feeling about work and things like that. So to Meg's point, I think you need to care first, what's happening with my team, and then how are we contributing. I think the second thing would be, after we've established that, it's a clarity as to what my team is responsible for delivering to the org. How are we doing it? Because if we're drowning, it's either we're layering in too many responsibilities from across the board, or maybe paying too many coordination taxes, which is causing a lot of problems. And that's why I think mapping out what are we delivering is going to be the next thing that I would do. And then once we have clarity on that, then we can actually go either to the CEO and say here's what we're doing. This is the bottleneck. I think I need 3 more people, or we need to invest in this tool. I think I would come up with solutions and say either we cut back on this or you invest in this. And that would be my stance if I was team lead over there, with the 3 things I would do.
So you pretty much nailed most of my advice. I absolutely agree. Start with the team and get a pulse and clarity within the team, both for the grieving part of this change, but also clarity about the intention. So your job as a leader is not to spend all the time whinging, nor spend all the time telling everybody what maybe was on the shareholder meeting, right? You need to connect the dots for people in a way that's both human and aligned in the business. So starting out with both the tough love, hey, we didn't want to have a layoff. Nobody wanted that. The business overall, maybe our group is doing great, but the business overall has a reason that it needs to reduce cost quickly, and that's the context of the layoff. Obviously, we know there's layers under that story, but making sure that you have both the clarity of what the business is trying to achieve with this restructure, and then start with, exactly to your point, getting really clear on what the needs that you can deliver, getting really clear on how you might do your work differently, and have an expectation that you're going to think about what you're doing, not just the outcomes, but also how you're doing your work, how it will change in this new context, and spend the time as a team to really articulate, here's how we're making these decisions, and here's what that means in terms of whether we're going to have to move dates out, or whether we're going to have to shift what we're delivering, or to your point, whether we say, hey, without additional investment, this is what it looks like. I think these are all places where you can show up with leadership. And then from a personal thing, I always just keep playing the Rolling Stones in the background. You can't always get what you want, because if nothing else, it gives me a personal release to the reality of, I'm not going to convince anyone. I'm not going to convince the team that everything should be done differently, nor am I going to convince the CEO that we can't do everything. It is my job to make sure that we're doing the right things, and that I'm both appreciating and empathizing with both contexts, but also communicating as to how we're going to do something different with this new reality of less people.
And just to add to both of those, I think it's really easy to get super emotional. I mean, it's an emotional topic, but that often causes one to quickly generalize, right? And just start to rant of like, oh, we can't do this. We need this, right? And that is not going to help you. That's not going to help the team. It's not going to help the business. So the best thing that you can do is really, like both Usman and Meg said, is to get that work inventory. And to, kind of validate the priorities of various outcomes that you have, and to mobilize your team to come together to figure that out, to get that all documented in a very kind of objective way, so that then you can bring that forward as facts to the CEO, to the leadership, to be able to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to do it. And here is what we need if you want more, right? And to really lay it out very, very thoughtfully. Because it's just so easy to go to that emotional state of, we need more people, and we can't do any of the stuff you asked us to do. And then invariably what happens then is you say, well, we can do this if you just give us all of these things. And then the CEO says, great, you'll do all those things, but you don't get any more people, and you don't get any more resources or tools. So good luck with all that. So it's very easy to fall into that emotional trap, and it does not work out for you well. So really being able to lay it out and have your team help you lay it out together is what I would suggest.
I think we did it. Go team. Yeah.
We nailed it. Usman, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
And taking a chance on us. We're really grateful, because we knew this was going to be a fun conversation, and I don't know, we learned a lot. I'm sure that Amy feels the same, that this has been a brain expanding conversation. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
Indeed.
No, it's been great. I think talking about it, hearing your points of view, especially because, like you mentioned, I'm an outsider, also haven't worked at larger companies, so it's always great to talk with people who have that experience to see like where the gaps in my thinking is, because I usually come from the scrappy entrepreneurship side, which also has a lot of gaps in our thinking, and yeah, that's basically how plugging everything away works.
Well, that was amazing. Just
Wasn't
as we imagined to have Usman Sheikh on our show. How fabulous.
How lucky are we?
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Please do send in your Leadership Corner questions. As you know, we do love to answer those. And please subscribe to the show, share it with others. It's really gaining some momentum. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, the LinkedIn push lately has been really good. So all of you that have joined our LinkedIn page, thank you for that. We're really grateful. So with that, let's invent the future together, everyone. I believe in us.
Let's make every day count.